My name is Angela Turner. I am 32 years old, and until one Thursday evening in early autumn, I believed the locks on my home were enough to keep my parents out of my life. I was wrong. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw their silver sedan parked at the curb, engine still running. They did not wave. They did not get out. They waited until I noticed the small wrapped box sitting on my doorstep, and then they drove away without a word. A white card had been tied beneath the ribbon, 4 words written in my mother's careful looping handwriting. Don't make a scene. I should have left it untouched. Every instinct I had spent years building told me to call someone before I touched anything that came from my parents. But the warning on that card felt like just another command from childhood, and some old, obedient part of me picked the box up anyway and carried it into the entryway. I cut the ribbon with kitchen scissors, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. The first thing I saw was a photograph of my son asleep in his own bedroom, taken from an angle no visitor to our house would ever have. The second was a duplicate key to our front door. Beneath those sat a thick envelope stamped with the letterhead of a family court attorney I had never met. My knees nearly gave out under me. I did not open the envelope. I dialed 911 with the fingers that would not stop shaking, and I have never in my life been more grateful for the calm, flat voice of a dispatcher asking me to breathe and describe what I was looking at. 2 patrol officers arrived within 11 minutes. They separated the contents of the box on our dining table without touching anything with bare hands, and they told me firmly not to go near it again until they understood what they were dealing with. That was when my husband, Mark, came through the front door, home early for once, calling my name before he saw the uniforms. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went from the officers to the open box, to the photograph of Nathan lying face up on the table, and all the color left his face at once. Please don't tell me, he whispered, more to himself than to me. They actually did it. Those 5 words frightened me more than the photograph had. They meant my husband knew something I did not. The older of the 2 officers introduced himself as Officer Ramirez. He had a quiet, methodical way of moving, the kind of calm that made a room feel more dangerous rather than less. He turned toward Mark and asked him directly what he meant. For several seconds, Mark seemed unable to decide whether to look at me or at the box. Finally, he pointed to the family court envelope and asked whether anyone had removed the papers inside. Ramirez said no, not yet. Mark swallowed hard. 3 weeks ago, he said, her father asked me to sign something. He told me it was an emergency guardianship arrangement in case Angela and I were ever both hospitalized at the same time. I refused. I never told her. I stared at him. He had never mentioned a single word of that conversation. Mark explained haltingly that my father Frank had approached him outside his office one afternoon, speaking in the same calm, almost bureaucratic tone he might use to discuss homeowners insurance. When Mark asked why such a document was suddenly necessary, Frank had said that my mother Nancy believed I had become emotionally unstable and that someone responsible needed to be prepared to step in. Mark had told him to stay away from us. Frank had only smiled and said, "You may not get to make that decision." Mark had kept quiet about all of it because he thought telling me would reopen wounds I had spent years trying to close. Standing there in our entryway, I wanted to be furious with him, but the box sat between us like proof that his silence, however well-intentioned, had only given my parents more room to move without resistance. Officer Ramirez pulled on a pair of gloves before he continued through the box. Beneath the family court envelope, he found a small digital audio recorder, a flash drive, 6 photographs, a child's wooden toy train, and a stuffed bear I recognized the instant I saw it. The train belonged to my 8-year-old son, Nathan. The bear had disappeared after our last visit to my parents' house 4 months earlier, and I had spent an entire evening searching under his bed for it before giving up and telling him it must have gotten lost in the car. When Ramirez lifted the bear out of the box, a faint, familiar scent drifted into the room. My mother's perfume. The same scent that used to linger outside my bedroom door when I was a teenager, whenever she stood there listening before she knocked. For the one sharp, disorienting instant, I was 16 years old again, hiding college brochures under my mattress because Nancy had already decided which school I would attend and did not want to hear otherwise. The memory did not arrive as a full scene. It arrived as pressure behind my ribs, the click of a doorknob turning, and her voice asking why a daughter who truly loved her family would ever need to keep secrets. The photographs were worse. One showed Nathan asleep in his bed, the same image from the top of the box, but a different angle, taken through a window. Another showed him eating cereal at our kitchen island, laughing at something off camera. A third had clearly been taken through the chain-link fence behind his elementary school. The timestamps printed in the corners spanned almost 2 months. In one image, a faint reflection in a window caught part of the photographer's face. It was not Nancy. It was not Frank. It was a man I did not recognize at all. Officer Ramirez's posture changed the moment he saw that reflection. He stopped treating the box like an ugly family dispute that had spilled onto our porch. He called his supervisor, requested that an evidence technician be sent out, and asked me directly whether my parents had ever had a key to our house. I told him the truth. Frank had helped us replace the lock on our back door the year before, back when we still spoke regularly. We had changed the front lock after cutting contact with my parents 8 months ago, but in all the chaos of that decision, we had never gotten around to changing the back one. Mark closed his eyes. Neither of us needed to say out loud what that meant. Inside the family court envelope was a draft petition asking a judge to grant my parents temporary control over Nathan. Most of the document was unsigned, but several supporting statements had already been carefully typed and formatted, ready to be filed. According to those statements, I had missed medical appointments, left Nathan unattended on multiple occasions, threatened relatives during emotional outbursts, and suffered unpredictable episodes that made our home an unsafe environment for a child. None of it was true. Not one word. One statement carried what looked, at first glance, like Mark's signature. He leaned over the page, studied it for a long moment, and said quietly, "That is not mine." Another page appeared to be a letter from a licensed therapist describing private counseling sessions with me that had never happened, sessions that supposedly documented a pattern of instability serious enough to warrant removing Nathan from my care before, as the letter phrased it, an avoidable crisis occurred. The language was polished and clinical and utterly convincing, because it had been engineered specifically to sound reasonable to a stranger reading it cold. Ramirez asked about the recorder. Mark recognized the model immediately. 2 months earlier, he had found a nearly identical device wedged beneath the passenger seat of our car. At the time, he had assumed it belonged to a coworker who occasionally rode with him to job sites, but when he later asked, the coworker denied ever seeing it or owning anything like it. Mark had thrown the device in the trash without thinking twice. This recorder, the one Ramirez now held in gloved fingers, had a strip of black adhesive tape on the back and a small handwritten label that read Kitchen 2. Ramirez placed it carefully in an evidence bag without switching it on. Kitchen 2, he said almost to himself, suggests there may have been a kitchen 1 somewhere else. The sentence seemed to change the air pressure in the entire house. The officers asked our permission to do a quick protective sweep of the home for any obvious surveillance equipment while we waited for the evidence technician to arrive. Mark and I agreed without hesitation. Inside a smoke detector mounted above our kitchen table, they found a tiny camera lens angled to capture the entire dining area. Behind a vent grill in the hallway near Nathan's bedroom, they found a second device. Neither camera was connected to our home Wi-Fi network, which meant they had been storing footage locally on internal memory cards. and whoever had installed them had planned to return in person to retrieve the recordings. The officers also noted faint fresh scratches around the back door lock, the kind left behind by someone working a key that did not quite fit smoothly the first few times. I remembered, with a slow, sick feeling, seeing my mother at Nathan's school fundraiser 2 weeks earlier, smiling warmly as though the distance between our families were nothing more than a temporary misunderstanding that time would heal. She had hugged me tightly before I had a chance to step back. At the time, I had assumed she simply wanted to embarrass me in front of other parents. Now I found myself wondering whether Frank had been inside our home at that exact hour, while she kept me occupied and smiling in a school gymnasium 3 miles away. The evidence technician arrived and photographed everything in careful, methodical sequence. Before he left, Ramirez warned us that forged documents alone would not necessarily prove who had created them, and that family court petitions could be drafted and even notarized without ever actually being filed with a court. He said that combined with the photographs, the duplicate key, and the hidden surveillance devices, however, the picture painted here was significantly more serious than a family disagreement. He strongly advised us not to confront my parents directly, not to post anything online, and not to tell extended family what had been found, at least not yet. Then he asked whether we had somewhere else we could stay for the night. Mark's sister lived across the bay. Leaving our own home felt, in that moment, like surrendering something I had already fought too hard to keep. But I packed one bag for Nathan and one for the two of us anyway. Nathan was at a friend's supervised birthday dinner that evening, and Mark arranged for his sister to pick him up directly from there, without explaining any of the details over the phone. Before we left, Ramirez handed me a property receipt for the items his team was taking into evidence, and asked one final question. "Did your parents know your husband would be home late tonight?" I told him yes. Nancy had called Mark's office that morning, pretending to confirm plans for a family dinner that did not actually exist. Ramirez looked at where the box had been sitting on the doorstep, then back at our open front door. "They may have expected you to open this alone," he said quietly. I understood finally what had been hidden beneath the ribbon all along. "Don't make a scene" had never been a plea for calm. It had been an instruction to remain isolated, to open that box in private, with no witnesses and no one to call. As we stepped outside, the evidence technician emerged from the hallway holding a third evidence bag. Inside was a memory card labeled, in handwriting I recognized instantly as my mother's, with my own name and a date from 6 years earlier. The week Nathan was born. We spent that night at Mark's sister's house, but I did not sleep. Every creak from the hallway made me imagine a key turning somewhere in our own back door, miles away. Nathan was told a burst pipe had forced us out of the house for one night. He accepted the explanation easily, curled up on his aunt's couch, and asked, right before he drifted off, whether his grandparents knew where we were staying. The question was innocent. It also revealed, more clearly than anything else that day, just how thoroughly Nancy had inserted herself into every corner of his world. I told him no, they did not, and sat beside him until his breathing slowed and evened out. Across the room, Mark watched me with something between guilt and fear written plainly across his face. Once Nathan was asleep, Mark apologized again for hiding Frank's approach from me. I told him I was hurt, and that I understood, and that both things could be true at once. My parents had spent years training everyone around them, myself included, to manage my reactions instead of confronting their behavior directly. That pattern, I decided somewhere in the dark of that unfamiliar guest room, was going to end that night. The next morning, Detective Cho called us back to the station. Not Ramirez this time, but a detective named Lena Cho, who handled cases involving stalking and electronic surveillance. She had a careful, unhurried way of speaking that told me she chose every word deliberately. The memory card labeled with the week of Nathan's birth had not come from any device found in our current home. It contained scanned documents, audio recordings, and photographs collected over the course of nearly 6 years. The earliest recording was a conversation between Nancy and me in my hospital room, hours after Nathan was born. I remembered that conversation. I had simply never known it was being recorded. On the audio, Nancy urged me, gently and with apparent concern, to sign a temporary medical authorization form because I was exhausted after delivery and shouldn't be making decisions alone. I refused, my recorded voice thick with exhaustion but firm. After I left the room to see Nathan in the nursery, Frank's voice appeared on the recording, speaking to someone else in the hallway. "She will come around," he said, "once she realizes how little control she actually has." Hearing that sentence, 6 years after the fact, felt like discovering a trap door hidden beneath a floor I had walked across every day of my adult life without ever suspecting it was there. The same card held copies of our tax returns, Mark's work schedule going back years, Nathan's full school calendar, and a long series of handwritten notes documenting arguments Mark and I had had in what we believed was total privacy. Most of the notes twisted ordinary, forgettable details into something sinister. A canceled dentist appointment had been rewritten as medical neglect. A babysitter arriving 10 minutes late became a child left dangerously unsupervised. A single photograph of me holding one glass of wine at a holiday dinner had been carefully labeled substance concern. My parents had not been documenting danger. They had been manufacturing a story, one carefully aged detail at a time, for exactly the kind of moment that had now arrived. Detective Cho was careful not to promise us an arrest. She explained that the digital files would need to be authenticated before anything could be used in court, and that the hidden surveillance devices still had to be traced back to whoever had actually installed them. She also warned us that Frank had already contacted the department himself. He described the box as nothing more than a family archive delivered during a heated disagreement, and suggested I was overreacting due to what he called long-standing emotional problems. He had even offered the name of a retired police captain who would supposedly vouch for what an honorable, upstanding member of the community Frank had always been. The move was so predictable, so exactly in character, that it almost calmed me. He had not once asked whether I was safe. He had gone straight to controlling the story. Detective Cho recommended we change our locks immediately, place a security alert with Nathan's school, and pursue a temporary restraining order without delay. That afternoon, our attorney, Melissa Grant, reviewed everything with us in her office. She found the forged guardianship petition disturbingly professional at first glance, but on closer inspection, something the rest of us had completely missed. The license number listed for the supposed therapist belonged to a real practicing professional, but the name typed on the letter did not match the state registry at all. The notary stamp on Mark's forged signature was genuine, but that particular notary seal had been reported stolen from an office 3 months earlier. Someone had assembled the entire file out of fragments of real identities and real credentials, betting that no one would look closely enough to notice the seams. Melissa strongly advised against any direct contact with my parents. Instead, she drafted a formal legal notice ordering them to stop contacting us, stop approaching Nathan's school, stop entering our property, and stop using any of our personal records. Mark wanted to send it immediately. I asked for 10 minutes alone first, sitting by myself in that quiet conference room, staring at the page. I remembered being 22 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen holding an acceptance letter to a graduate program on the other side of the country. Frank had taken the letter from my hand, folded it twice without asking, and told me the family had already invested enough in my experiments. Nancy had cried until I agreed to stay in the Bay Area. For years afterward, I told people that decision had been entirely my own, because admitting the truth felt more humiliating than the decision itself. Now, a decade later, the same two people were trying to rewrite my entire adulthood into another document they could quietly control. I picked up the pen and signed the notice. That evening, Detective Cho called with the first real break in the case. A serial number recovered from the hallway camera led investigators to a local security equipment retailer. The buyer had paid in cash, but the store's own surveillance footage clearly showed his face at the register. His name was Calvin Rhee, a private investigator whose license had been suspended 2 years earlier following multiple complaints involving illegal tracking of private citizens. Phone records obtained through an emergency preservation request showed repeated sustained contact between Rhee's number and a line registered to Frank's small business. Cho warned us not to celebrate too quickly. Contact between two phone numbers was not by itself proof of a conspiracy, and Rhee could easily claim he had only ever been hired for lawful observation work. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that officers had gone to his listed office address that afternoon and found it completely emptied out overnight. Furniture, files, everything. He was gone. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a voice message from Nancy. She did not mention the police, the box, or anything that had happened. She said only that she had heard Nathan might be missing school and offered warmly to pick him up and keep him until things settled down. Her tone was soft, almost maternal. The exact voice she had used on me my entire childhood whenever she wanted something to go a certain way. At the very end of the message, her voice dropped lower. A judge will care about stability, Angela. Think very carefully before you make yourself look unstable. I forwarded the message to Detective Cho without replying. For the first time in my life, I did not hear my mother as some all-powerful figure standing over me. I heard a woman reciting lines from a script she had rehearsed 100 times before. Then Melissa called with news that changed everything again. The fake emergency petition was no longer just a draft sitting in a cardboard box on our dining table. Someone had attempted to file it with the family court that very morning. Melissa obtained a copy directly from the courthouse and discovered that Frank and Nancy were asking a judge for an emergency order before I could even be formally notified. Their petition claimed Mark and I had disappeared with Nathan following some kind of domestic crisis, that police had been called to our home because I was behaving irrationally, and that my parents were the only relatives capable of providing Nathan with immediate stability. They had taken our desperate call for police help and twisted it into the centerpiece of evidence against us. Attached to the petition were the forged therapist's letter, Mark's falsified signature, carefully cropped photographs, and a sworn declaration from Calvin Rhee, who described himself only as a licensed family safety consultant, omitting entirely the fact that his investigator's license had been suspended. The petition requested temporary emergency guardianship of Nathan, full access to his school records, and possession of a key to our home. Melissa filed a formal opposition before the assigned judge could act on the request. Because the petition alleged an immediate risk to a child, the court scheduled an emergency hearing for the following afternoon. Detective Cho could not testify to what conclusions her criminal investigation would eventually reach, but she provided a sworn declaration confirming that hidden cameras, a duplicate house key, and documents suspected to be forged had all been recovered from our home 2 days earlier. Officer Ramirez's own body camera footage, complete with timestamps, proved conclusively that police had responded to evidence we ourselves had reported, not to any disturbance I had caused. My parents arrived at the courthouse the next day, dressed as though they were attending a charity luncheon rather than a hearing about their own grandson. Nancy wore pale blue and carried a leather folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Frank greeted two attorneys in the hallway with easy familiarity and nodded to a clerk who seemed to recognize him from somewhere. When his eyes finally found mine across the corridor, he did not look ashamed, and he did not look frightened. He looked disappointed, in exactly the same way he used to look when I brought home a grade he considered beneath our family's standards. Nancy took one step toward Nathan, who was waiting with Mark's sister farther down the hall, but a court officer moved to intercept her, citing the temporary no-contact order Melissa had secured. For just a second, her expression flickered. The warmth vanished, and something colder and harder moved beneath it before the pleasant mask slid back into place. Inside the courtroom, my parents' attorney described them as devoted, worried grandparents responding to alarming information about their daughter's household. He called the box on our doorstep a clumsy, misguided attempt to share family records. He said the photographs of Nathan had been taken simply to document his daily routine, out of genuine fear for his safety. He described the duplicate key as an old spare that had accidentally been left among returned belongings years ago. Every act of surveillance became concern. Every documented lie became a misunderstanding, softened and reframed until it barely resembled what it actually was. Then Melissa placed the original, uncropped photographs beside the versions attached to the petition. The unaltered images showed full timestamps and much wider backgrounds than the versions Frank had submitted. One photograph, labeled in the petition as Nathan wandering alone outside his school, showed clearly, once uncropped, that Mark had been standing only a few feet away the entire time. Another, labeled Angela intoxicated at a family gathering, revealed a full birthday celebration with 6 other adults raising identical glasses of wine in a toast. The judge asked, directly and without warmth, why the submitted images had been altered before filing. My parents' attorney requested a brief recess to consult privately with his clients. Frank leaned in and whispered something urgent to Nancy. She interrupted him instead, standing abruptly, saying she could explain everything herself. The judge ordered her to sit down unless specifically called to testify. She sat, but she kept talking anyway, her voice rising steadily. She said I had always been impulsive, that Mark was weak and easily led, that someone in this family had to plan responsibly for Nathan's future because I clearly could not be trusted to do it myself. She insisted the family could not simply wait around for me to collapse under some crisis of my own making. Melissa seized the opening and asked calmly whether Nancy had ever authorized anyone to enter our home without permission. Their attorney objected immediately, but the judge allowed a narrow answer since the original petition itself had requested access to our property. Nancy looked directly at me, across the entire length of the courtroom, and said, "A mother does what is necessary when her daughter refuses to accept help." It was not a full confession, but it was more than enough to shatter the careful, sympathetic image she had spent an entire morning constructing. Frank grabbed her arm and hissed at her to stop talking. The judge noticed. So did the court reporter, whose fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard. Melissa then played the voicemail in which Nancy warned that a judge would care about stability. Because Nancy had sent the message directly to my personal phone, there was no question of illegal recording or consent. The judge listened to it twice in complete silence. After the second playback, he denied the emergency guardianship request in full, prohibited my parents from any contact whatsoever with Nathan or his school, and referred the forged documents directly to the court's fraud investigation unit. He also ordered that no future petition filed by either of them would be considered without prior notice to Mark and me. Outside the courtroom, Frank finally lost the composure he had worn all morning like an expensive suit. He stepped toward me fast enough that a court officer moved bodily between us. "You have no idea what you've just started," he said, low and furious. "People know us. They know exactly what kind of daughter you are." For most of my life, a sentence like that would have silenced me instantly. This time, I looked back at him and said, "Then let them see the evidence." Nancy began crying, though I noticed there were no actual tears on her cheeks. She told Mark he was allowing me to destroy Nathan's relationship with his own grandparents. Mark told her, evenly, that they had destroyed that relationship themselves the moment they broke into our home. Frank's jaw tightened. "You cannot prove anyone entered that house," he said. Detective Cho, who had been waiting quietly near the elevators the entire time, spoke from behind him. "We're working on that," she said. Frank turned and saw her badge clipped to her jacket, and for the first time all day, real uncertainty crossed his face. Cho asked both my parents to come down to the station voluntarily for questioning. Their attorney declined on their behalf and hurried them both toward the elevator before either could say another word. As the door slid shut, Nancy stared at me across the shrinking gap with an expression of open, undisguised hatred, no longer bothering to hide it behind anything at all. Just before the doors closed completely, I saw her lift her phone and begin typing. Less than 5 minutes later, every member of our extended family received a message from her, claiming I had suffered some kind of breakdown, manipulated the police into harassing innocent grandparents, and tried to have my own loving parents wrongfully arrested out of spite. What Nancy did not realize, in her hurry and her fury, was that she had attached the wrong file to that message. Beneath her frantic, self-serving text was a photograph, clearly taken from one of the hidden cameras, showing our kitchen table from an angle only someone standing inside a smoke detector could ever have captured. She tried to delete the message within minutes of sending it. It did not matter. Too many relatives had already opened it, and at least 3 of them had taken screenshots before it vanished. My cousin sent me one of those screenshots before I had even reached my car in the courthouse parking garage, along with a single message. "Angela, what is this? Why does she have a photo like this?" That single mistake did more damage to my parents' carefully maintained reputation than anything Melissa or Detective Cho could have accomplished in a courtroom. Within a week, 3 separate relatives who had spent decades taking Frank and Nancy's side in every family disagreement called me, quietly and separately, to ask if they could talk. One aunt admitted she had always found Nancy's need for control unsettling, but had never had proof of anything beyond a feeling. A cousin, closer to my own age, told me she had once found a small recording device in her own guest bedroom after a visit from my parents years earlier, and had assumed at the time it must belong to someone else's child. The criminal investigation moved slowly but steadily over the following 2 months. Calvin Rhee was eventually located in a rented apartment 3 counties away, still using a fake name to sign the lease. Faced with digital evidence tracing his purchases, his phone records, and surveillance footage from the security store, he agreed to cooperate rather than face additional felony charges on his own. He confirmed that Frank had hired him more than a year earlier, initially just to monitor whether Mark and I were, in his words, fit parents, and that the arrangement had escalated steadily over time into full surveillance, forged documentation, and eventually the attempted filing of a fraudulent emergency petition. He testified that Frank had personally directed the installation of both hidden cameras and had kept a spare key made from an impression taken during that lock replacement job years earlier. Frank was charged with stalking, unlawful surveillance, and multiple counts of forgery related to the fabricated court documents. Nancy faced lesser charges tied directly to her own recorded statements and the attempted filing. But the fraud unit's investigation into exactly how deep her involvement ran continued for months afterward. Their case moved through the courts far slower than the emotional wreckage it left behind. But for the first time in my adult life, the story being told about our family was not one my parents got to write, edit, or control. Nathan, for his part, never learned most of the details. He knew only that his grandparents had done something serious enough that they were no longer allowed to see him, and that his parents had needed some time to sort out an important grown-up problem. He asked questions occasionally, the way children do, in small, unguarded moments, usually right before falling asleep. Each time, Mark and I answered honestly but simply, careful never to hand him more weight than an 8-year-old should have to carry. Mark and I spent a long time repairing the space between us that Frank's quiet, 3-week-old conversation had opened up. It was not instant, and it was not always comfortable. But we talked, really talked, in a way our marriage had somehow avoided for years, and slowly the guilt on his face began to fade into something steadier. As for me, I changed every lock in our house twice over the following year, had our internet network audited by a professional, and learned, slowly, what it felt like to walk through my own kitchen without flinching at the smoke detector. I still hear my mother's voice sometimes, in quiet moments, asking why a daughter who truly loved her family would ever need to keep secrets. But I know now, with a certainty that took 32 years and one wrapped box on a doorstep to reach, exactly whose secrets those really were. Don't make a scene, the card had said. I made one anyway. And for the first time in my life, it was entirely on my own terms.